Since you're watching this YouTube channel, you've probably spent a lot of time on the internet looking for music recommendations. Whether it's on YouTube, streaming services, music forums, social media, review outlets, there's no shortage of ways to find music online. As thankful as I am to live in an era where I can basically find and stream any music I'm looking for in seconds, one unfortunate thing that has come with the internet as far as music and other art forms go is
mob mentality.
Depending on where you look, whether it be social media or an online forum, people's tastes become very collective, with large groups of people loving and hating certain artists. Now, I'm not bringing this up because I think it's super awful or anything. I mean, there has to be a reason why OK Computer is generally more well-liked than Blood on the Dance Floor's Unplugged album, but the reason I am bringing this up is because the subject of today's video managed to do the impossible and be genuinely polarizing across all corners of the internet. Because of how easy it is to share and look at others' opinions nowadays, it's easy for many people to go into things with certain expectations or feel like they're supposed to like or dislike certain pieces of media. Possibly more than any other musical act I'm aware of, the artists involved in Drain Gang have gathered a completely love or completely hate reaction from the internet. In fact, I'm willing to bet that half of you clicked on this video because you like Bladee and wanted to hear someone talk about him, while the other half of you hate him and either wanted to make fun of me for saying anything positive, or are genuinely interested in why so many defend him so religiously. Or you're completely unaware, in which case, boy do I have something to show you. This complete division of opinions is what made me compelled to check out the whole Drainer scene to begin with, and I've grown pretty fascinated by it. But before I delve off into that, here's a little context. The artist who these guys, and really this entire sound, could be traced back to is Young Lean, a Swedish rapper who many were quick to dismiss as a joke. I mean, I can't really blame them, his lyrics aren't anything to write home about, and his name is Young Lean. In the past few years, though, this guy has seen a bit of a critical resurgence, as his immensely detailed, cloudy, and explosive approach to production on some of his more popular songs, like Kyoto for example, wound up influencing, or at least predicting, an entire wave of artists who use the basic assets of trap music, combined with a more atmospheric and psychedelic soundscape, to create a genre which we now know as cloud rap. The genre existed in some capacity before Young Lean, whether that be through artists like Lil B, A$AP Rocky, or some experimental oddities from years past, but Lean was one of the first to take this sound and fuse it with the bass, hi-hats, and auto-tune which we're all familiar with today. While cloud rap has become very oversaturated in the past few years, mostly on SoundCloud, it offers so much potential for creativity. I very much see cloud rap as being this generation's answer to shoegaze, and to a lesser extent slowcore. The way these genres mess around with guitar amp settings to make music with a dense atmosphere for the listener to get lost into very much mirrors the different approach to production that cloud rap has to offer. I understand that not everyone has taken to the genre all that well yet, as it can be pretty easy to replicate given how it usually banks more on atmosphere than songwriting, and of course there's always going to be that one group of people who think that all rappers gotta be lyrical, spiritual, spherical, miracle individuals in your swimming pools, but teach their own. Lean collaborated with producers Young Sherman and Young Good to form a group called Sad Boys, and associated themselves with another group, then called Gravity Boys, containing rappers Bladee, Echo 2K, and Thaiboy Digital, as well as producers Whitearmor and Young Sherman. Yes, he's a part of both. Why these two groups didn't decide to just become one unit to avoid confusion?
The world may never know.
They've been putting out music since 2013, sometimes collaborative, but it's usually just a Bladee album with features from each member. Seriously, despite how long these guys have been around, Bladee is the only one to actually build up a sizable discography. Young Sherman has released a couple solo EPs, Thaiboy Digital has a couple mixtapes, and just recently an album under his belt, and Echo 2K... The early years of Drain Gang have a much more abstract, DIY sense of composition. They independently released their first project in 2013 titled GTBSG, which I can only assume stands for Gets the Better Scores generally. When listening back to this tape compared to the group's later releases, it's clear that this is a vague outline of what the group's full artistic vision was. Nearly every song on here creates this extremely drug-out atmosphere, relying on modern production techniques like 808s, reverb, and autotune. It's one of the first projects that helped usher in the new era of psychedelic music that is cloud rap, and because of that I think it deserves much more attention. The group signed to year 0001 the following year. Thaiboy Digital would release his debut mixtape Tiger, and Bladee would release his debut album, mixtape, EP, his debut project Gluee. Gluee, despite being Blade's most left-field solo project, is generally his most well-liked. It still has a very amateurish edge to it the way many debuts do, but because Blade's approach to making music is pretty abstract to begin with, the album only benefits from it. The synth leads on tracks like Safe House and Unreal are extremely melodic, yet since the rest of the mix is so drenched in reverb on top of the harshly auto-tuned vocals, it sounds completely otherworldly. Meanwhile, cuts like Shadowface and Freeze take more cues from ambient pop, giving the album a healthy balance of highs and lows, playing out like a drug trip. The whole thing is comparatively lo-fi when looking at his later records, which likely contributes to the abrasion in the vocals, especially on Everlasting Flames, where Bladee and Thaiboy more or less vocal harmonize with each other. If you're looking for an abstract pop album that has strong elements of cloud rap and ambient music, then this is certainly where I'd recommend starting. Much like how the group was still coming into their own from a musical perspective, the visuals that accompanied Drain Gang, whether that be through their music videos, cover arts, or line of clothing which resells for a lot of money online, were still developing in this time period. Music videos from this era, like Car Wash, Bleach, and Into Dust, which is the most viewed video on their YouTube channel, look extremely amateurish and low budgeted, yet fit the DIY style of the music very well. A couple years after Gluee, Bladee would drop what many fans consider his magnum opus, Eversince. This was the true turning point for Bladee and the rest of Drain Gang, as the group really began to come into their own both musically and aesthetically. While the album maintains the same psychedelic atmosphere of its predecessor, it's seen a massive overhaul in production. The lo-fi vocals and muddy mixes have pretty much disappeared in favor of more dense and immaculate production. Whitearmor's beats on here are seriously some of the most highly detailed and engaging to come out of this entire new wave of hip-hop. While they might not sound that unique on the surface, the way the fractured melodies play off of the usually slow-paced but sometimes driving rhythms makes for instrumentals that are as hypnotic as they are emotionally provocative. It's perfectly paired with Blade's vocals, which are still entirely trenched in autotune, but for this style it really couldn't go any other way. His voice rides over but sinks a little into these beats, making the vocals sound like a cross between another instrumental layer and traditional vocal layering. However, this is where Blade's music begins to get very, polarizing. He performs in a way that's very robotic and kind of monotone, which puts a lot of people off from his music, at least at first. Most people who I've seen online, myself included, have said that Bladee was an acquired taste for them, taking a few listens to really appreciate how the entire sound comes together. While it's fair to describe his voice as being monotone, the way that he weaves these vocals into these songs communicates a very real emotion in a subtle way, putting the listener in the mindset of someone who's drained. This is also what's led me to label this whole Drainer scene as outsider trap, as their music has a lot in common with other artists who get labeled as outsider music. Also, I know that they're more cloud rap than trap, but outsider cloud rap doesn't have the same ring to it. The genre tag usually refers to artists who make music that's extremely unconventional and challenging, but in a way that feels authentic. Artists like Daniel Johnston and Wesley Willis are big examples of this, as many are put off by their music because it sounds too amateurish or childlike, while just as many appreciate them for their evocative and distinct approach to songwriting. These artists weren't making music with the intention of being challenging or avant-garde in the same way an artist like Captain Beefheart was, yet people still give a very strong reaction one way or the other. I think Drain Gang very much mirrors this, as when I listen to an album like Eversince, I don't get the impression that they were trying to make something with the intent of challenging norms, but just had their own style. If you thought Eversince was polarizing though, then I'm gonna need you to put on the brakes, because there's a red light ahead. If Gluee is Blade's most generally well-liked and Eversince is the fan favorite, then Red Light is certainly his most divisive. While it doesn't depart from the style of Eversince all that much, the production on here is a bit more minimal. That's not to say the beats on here are any less detailed, but the synths and bass lines are quieter, putting Blade's vocals at the forefront of most of these songs. Since the vocals are what make people either love or hate Blade's music, it's no wonder that this album has garnered such a divisive response. I guess I should probably get this out of the way now. Red Light is my favorite Bladee album, period. While it might be easy to see it as his most conventional, with production that pulls more cues from popular trap and alternative R&B than its predecessors, the way that this album takes the current landscape of these genres and filters them through this outsider aesthetic makes for one of the most interesting experiences in the genre thus far. I find a lot of modern R&B to not be very interesting, whether that be because of production that's way too spacey for its own good, half-baked vocal melodies, or lyrics that are painfully predictable. While Blade's songwriting might be easy to dismiss as simplistic or even corny, there's something so endearing about it. The way his unconventional vocals, production, and lyrics come together creates this triumphant numbness that can't be understated. I know that since his vocals are kind of monotone, that limits the range for vocal melody, but he sounds fully aware of that. The vocal melodies on here are often kind of slow and not very dynamic, but this plays into the vibe that he's going for better than it would have otherwise. I also want to preface that while this album may be Blade's most alternative R&B influenced project yet, there's a ton of absolute bangers like Obedient and Decay, whose shimmering synths and hard-hitting percussion are just irresistible. There are a couple moments where the blunt sadness of his lyrics does come off a little more cringe than endearing, like on Nike Just Do It or the hook of That Thing You Do, but aside from that, I pretty much love everything this record has to offer. I understand why so many people dislike it, as it's not your typical set of cloud rap songs that are meant to be enjoyed by the masses. It's really emotional, but in a way that's abstract. 2018 also saw the release of a couple other notable Drain Gang projects, including this loose fan-made compilation of singles and rare tracks from Echo 2K called Beauty Sleep. Yeah, don't think I forgot about this thing. It's probably the most conventionally experimental project to come from the collective thus far, which I guess isn't surprising seeing as how it's not an official tape. It combines the more lo-fi sound of early Drain with the glittery sounds of later releases. Since a lot of the cuts on here are likely unfinished spare tracks, you can expect a really raw recording and unconventional structure to come out of many of these songs. While it is really interesting, it's still just a fan-made compilation and it shows just by listening to it. It's very rough around the edges and kind of poorly paced at times, but I know the demo-like quality of this thing is gonna be what attracts a lot of people to it. There really isn't much else to say about it, but it's worth bringing up because I feel like it gives insight into what this group has in store for us and how much potential they, and Echo specifically, have to drop something game-changing. I understand that the alienating nature of Drangang isn't going to appeal to as many people as the conventional cloud rap that they already helped to put on the map, but this Beauty Sleep tape sounds like a blueprint for what could be an abstract cloud rap odyssey of a magnitude the genre has yet to have seen. The project is already somewhat of a crown jewel in the Drainer community, so the audience is there for it. Echo, you better have been taking your time for a reason. Very late in 2018, Bladee dropped one of his most acclaimed projects yet, Icedancer, and while I wasn't the biggest fan of it when it initially came out, and I still don't find it as strong as some of his later releases, it's grown on me quite a bit. This thing has a very distinct personality from the rest of the Drangang discography. Much like the very colorful, abstract, headache-inducing cover art, this album is much more in your face, focusing more on rhythm than atmosphere. The drum beats on these cuts are much more hard-hitting and mixed higher, making the album more of a set of bangers than a moody dreamscape. Some of Blade's strongest tracks are on here, like Smart Water, Frosty the Snowman, Top Man, and if it's a demo, gotta bite it. Be Nice to Me is the best song ever. The biggest drawback of this tape for me is that I really don't find it varied enough to justify having 19 tracks. I like that Bladee has essentially reinvented while also staying true to himself once again, but listening to this whole thing gets kinda tiring for me. It's definitely Blade's poppiest and most accessible album so far, so if you were put off by projects like Red Light and Eversince, then I think this thing could change your mind, or at least have an easier time doing so. The most recent notable release from Drangang at the time of me making this video is Thaiboy Digital's long-awaited debut album Legendary Member, and, well, here's the thing. I didn't really talk about Thaiboy's other projects because honestly he sounded so similar to Bladee that talking about these things probably would have been redundant. I was hoping he'd craft more of a distinct sound for himself when he finally dropped an official album, and while he definitely moved away from sounding like Bladee on Legendary Member, this is probably the least drained sounding album I've heard from the collective thus far. The production on here, despite having many of the same tropes at its core, just isn't as distinct or engaging for me. This is likely due to the mixing, as a lot of the synths and drum beats are so thinned out and distant, but not in a way that feels intentionally lo-fi. Well, Thaiboy no longer sounds like a Bladee clone, now he sounds like Travis Scott, from the flow, delivery, production. I mean, come on, you can't listen to songs like Beijing and I Don't Give a Fuck and not hear what I'm talking about.
I get my money from Beijing, I get my money from Beijing. Yeah, we know, bounce on me, you can hit me now.
Now look, I don't have a problem with an artist taking influence from another, and I want this group to continue evolving over time, but for me this project just strips away a lot of what fascinated me about Drangang to begin with. Hell, hearing Blade's voice on Bentley halfway through the album felt like a godsend, and the final song featuring Bladee, Echo, and Young Lean is by far the best on the project. Also, the constantly braggadocious lyrics feel very unfitting for the usually vulnerable ethos of the group's music. It's an alright cloud rap album on its own, but I wish Thaiboy went in a more unique direction. I seem to be in the minority in feeling this way, so if you see something in this tape that I don't, then feel free to comment. There's a couple other Bladee projects that I didn't talk about, and I know someone in the comments is going to bring it up if I don't, so I may as well mention them before I wrap this video up. Rip Bladee is an interesting EP in his catalog, as it takes very heavy influence from drill. While it adds variety to his discography, I honestly don't think Blade's sound translates into this style of music all that well. The overpowering percussion and fast-paced tempos are kinda awkwardly juxtaposed against the sad boy atmosphere and Blade's delivery. If you like the bangers on Icedancer and haven't heard this thing, then you'll probably get something out of it. That just leaves Working on Dying, which is pretty cool. While Drangang has always taken a lot of production cues from what was at the time a rising trend of contemporary trap music, the hi-hats and bass ring out on this thing more than ever. It's definitely a more seamless combination than the drill on Rip Bladee, but if you like the more explosive and visceral side of Blade's music, then I'd highly recommend this nonetheless. I also feel like the cover art of this tape is somewhat of a starting point to their trademark abstract style of visual art that fits the music very nicely. While these tapes aren't really my favorites to come from Bladee, I could see people who don't like the atmospheric stuff gravitating to these a bit more. I know I didn't really talk about the group's collaborative projects all that much, but I honestly don't find these as notable as their individual releases. D&G pretty much plays out like one of those old Odd Future compilations, giving a sample as to how each member sounds, only with a much smaller roster and each member being too early in their career to really have a distinct sound from one another. The recent project Trash Island feels much more like a proper collaboration, as multiple members contribute to every track. Musically, this thing stands out a little as well, with the group having more production value than ever before, yet the beats on here are still kinda minimal, like Red Light. It's a solid project for what it is, but at the end of the day, feels kinda like a by-the-numbers drain project, if that makes any sense. Overall though, I find this group to be very interesting, both musically and visually, and I greatly appreciate how they've taken this very modern cloud rap genre and done something outside the norm. Whether or not the group has already peaked artistically is yet to be determined, but I see what they've currently done as opening the floodgates for how creative and interesting this genre really can be. I understand that a lot of people, probably even watching this video, have a very different opinion on these guys than I do, but just as Young Lean said,
if we were just making music and people would be like, okay, this is nice, you know. then you haven't done anything good. But if people are like, I hate this so much, this is so bad, or like, I love it so much.
I think the extreme reaction these guys get out of people makes them really fascinating, so whether you absolutely love or absolutely hate these guys, then more power to you. Thanks for watching, and if you liked the video, then you know the drill.
Daddy quit his job today, well I guess it was fine, but that's okay.